Welcome, Bible Timers, to the Monday edition. We're doing the Believers Fellowship Daily Bible Reading, and we're going through the book of Psalms. And today we have Psalms 83, 84, and 85 to look at. And Psalm 83 reminds us of something very important. We tend to read the Bible like it's about me, and I want God to talk to me. But that's not quite the way it works. Yeah, there's a message for you, but you have to understand it in the context that it's written in. Psalm 83 reminds us that the context, generally speaking, is Israel, especially here in the Old Testament. And when you read Psalm 83, you'll see that God's enemies are Israel's enemy because Israel was God's people, is God's people. And you can see statements there where they're trying to wipe them out. The enemies want to, they say, verse 4, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. You still hear that in the world today. There are countries today that would like Israel eliminated. The world is anti-God. Anything associated with God is going to be hated by the world. Israel is God's people, and so they are out to wipe out God's people. And so he's asking God to act in judgment against his enemies, the writer of the psalm is, and here's the ultimate purpose. It says, verse 16, fill their faces with shame that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be put to shame and dismayed forever. Let them perish in disgrace, that they may know that you alone, whose name is the Lord, are the most high over all the earth. So there's a purpose in God's judgment. It's to bring salvation. And if you read the book of Revelation, you read about the judgment that's going to come on the earth, the time of tribulation on the earth. You're going to see the nations being judged, but you're going to see a multitude getting saved at the same time because God's going to make himself so obvious. So that's a great psalm to read as you think about what's coming up in the future and as you think of God's commitment, God's steadfast love, God's covenant that he's made with Israel, starting with Abraham and then continuing through David and even the new covenant, all of them related to Israel. That's an important thing to remember as you study the Bible. Psalm 84 is a favorite psalm of many people, and you can break it down like this, as the writer rejoices in God, and the things that he rejoices in particular. First of all, he rejoices in God's presence. Verse 1, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord, for my heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God. Verse 4, blessed are those who dwell in your house, ever singing your praise. It's rejoicing in God's presence. And in their day, there was God's house. There was the temple where God's presence resided. And so to be in the presence of God, what a blessing that is. And then he rejoices in God's strength. Verse 5, blessed are those whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion. As they go through the valley of Baca, that's a valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs. The early rain also covers it with pools. They go from strength to strength. Each one appears before God in Zion, rejoicing in God's strength. Even though you can go through sad times, you can go from strength to strength because of the strength that the Lord provides. And then verses 9 through 12 would be to talk about God's grace. God's grace. The Lord bestows favor and honor, and no good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly. He's gracious. He's giving. We can trust in God. And you know, the thing that comes out of this too, better to be a doorkeeper in God's house than to live in the tents of the wicked. That's how precious it is. That's how valuable it is to be with God as opposed to anything else you could have in this world. A great psalm, a favorite of many people, Psalm 84. And then Psalm 85 is another important psalm because it brings up an important topic, the topic of revival. I know many of us are praying for revival, and that's what it's talking about in this psalm. The first three verses talk about how God forgives. In verse 2, you forgave the iniquity of your people. You covered their sin. You covered them. Covered the sins completely. And so thanking God for his forgiveness and praying to God for revival. Verse 4, restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you? Show us your steadfast love, O Lord, and grant us your salvation. It's a prayer for a revival. And for Israel, that revival day is assured. There is coming a day when Christ is going to return, and God's going to have purified Israel so that all of them that are there on the day he returns, as it says in Romans 11, all Israel will be saved. They will all look to him and see him as their coming Messiah, their coming King. That day of revival, that great day of revival is coming. Verse 10 talks about steadfast love and faithfulness, meeting righteousness and peace, kiss each other. That ultimately happens in the Messiah. Those things all come together in him. So there will be a great revival for the people of Israel, but we certainly can pray that for ourselves as well. We can pray for a revival amongst the churches in America. That so desperately needs to happen. You can talk about all the problems going on in our country right now, but one of the big contributors to that problem is the current condition of the church. You can pray that God would revive his people, that they'd come back to the Bible, that they'd come back to Christ, they'd come back to the truth, and we'd see a revival of true Christianity in our day. That's something worth praying about. That's a great way to start your week. I trust that you're fired up and ready to keep reading through these Psalms, learning about God, drawing close to him, and learning from the experiences of the writers of these Psalms. And let's pray that we might know God's strength during this week. We'll see you tomorrow for more Bible time.